you have worked more than 30 years as a nurse, chief nurse executive, innovation strategist, created recognized programs across the United States, bringing a framework to bring 4 million nurses into the innovation space. Also, a best-selling author, a self-described as a positive deviant, and a podcaster. Congratulations on that. And you're the first nurse that we've had here at the summit.
I am. I'm very grateful to be here and to be the first nurse. I think you need to have them every year.
Okay, good. We'll take that under advisement, Bonnie. Let's start by putting a really clear picture into people's heads. Robots in hospitals. It's already happening. I learned this by listening to your podcast. They are hunting and gathering for nurses, and they're actually beginning to make their lives easier. So why don't you describe this picture for us?
Well, if you can think about it, hospitals typically have a lot of long corridors. As nurses, we would not have designed them that way. We would have actually made smaller units, probably square or round units. But as units become very linear and very long, it takes a lot of effort to get from one side of a patient's room to a supply room and to actually go get things, or as we call it, to hunt and gather or to fetch. What we're finding out is that service robots are a great collaborative teammate and a partner. And as we communicate with them, they can actually go and retrieve items and bring them to us, saving us not only the steps, but they can make us much more efficient. Whether we're doing a dressing change or we need some linen, we need some surgical supplies, they can actually do that hunting and gathering for us.
Tell me how it works. How do they know what the hospital looks like?
Well, typically the robots that I'm familiar with, they have LiDAR as the way that they can map out the hospital.
And remind us what LiDAR is.
So they use that low frequency. They make the trips over and over. They actually have the engineers that follow them with the joysticks, and they can go around and map the hospital. They know the elevators, they know the floors, they know where the pharmacy is, where the supply rooms are. So they understand the layout of the hospital in their robot brain. When we need something, they can actually go fetch it for us. Some robots we're able to speak to and just tell them what we need, and they will literally go fetch it for us and bring it back. There are robots that have an articulating arm and can grab things out of supply rooms. There are robots that have barcode scanners for eyebrows and actually can scan things and find them that way. What we're finding, though, is that it makes us much more efficient because we don't have to leave a patient's bedside. We can stay where we are, and they will go do that task for us and bring us the supplies or the goods.
What's it like for the nurses when a robot joins the team?
Yeah, that's a great question. Socializing the robots is a little bit of a challenge because to start with, nurses typically don't want robots. They think they're going to be in the way. They're going to go very slow down the hall. What happens if there's an emergency or a code? The robot's just going to be stopped dead in the middle of the hallway. Nowadays, many of the robots have actually been programmed that if they hear the code blue or the overhead kind of patient alarms, they actually can pull themselves against the wall so they know to get out of the way. And in many cases now, because there aren't enough nursing staff or even enough patient care technicians or CNAs, it is very helpful to have the robot. So the nurses are welcoming them with a much more warm greeting than they used to be.
Interesting. I learned a fact from your podcast, something I experience every time I go to the doctor's office in the UK. We're going to have to take care of more people with fewer nurses and other clinicians. No one knows this better than nurses, I imagine. So tell me about a technology that you've come across that has taken nurses' input into what's been designed and developed so that it meets their needs.
So this is a little bit of a trick question set up here, because what typically happens is that nurses are not involved in the design and development of technology. What's more typical is that typically it's the physicians that inform that process and actually provide the direct input. In fact, even as I was rounding here today on some of the booths, was asking some of the different vendors that had healthcare applications who provided input, and every one of them said physicians. And when I asked them if nurses did, they said no. So while that might be appropriate when it comes to some of the diagnostics and the imaging and pathology, it is very appropriate to get input from the direct users, which tend to be the nurses or other clinical disciplines who are actually doing the workflows and applying these treatments or these devices to the patients. So I think the lesson here isn't that it's one or the other, it has to be both.
And why is it? What would a nurse say that another clinician wouldn't?
So here's just some examples of that. I talked to a company years ago that called and wanted to demo a product that they developed, and it was a surgical application that was actually going to help them track some of the orthopedic implants. So they demoed their app to me, and I asked them what problem it solved, and they said, well, it was going to help the nurses. So I said, how many nurses did you talk to? And the guy was a little bit quiet, and finally he said, well, we did talk to one. And I said, what kind of nurse was it? He said, actually, it was a surgeon. It's difficult to get input when you don't understand the workflows because nursing workflows are so very different. Our steps are different. We spend more time with patients and their families, so the work that we do is very different than the work that physicians do. So again, it always goes back to you can't do one without the other. It really requires the team. So getting input from those nurses is going to help you ascertain what the issues and the problems are with the workflow so you can prevent them from happening in the first place.
Give me some examples about some of the things that you have found speaking to other nurses that they're looking for. What are they looking for AI to solve or help them with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are some apps that I'm familiar with in the United States. One of them is actually an app that actually does detection of pre-sepsis, so detecting a patient that's going to become septic before they even become septic. So before our human eyes and ears know that a patient is going to be heading into a very bad or an untoward situation, these systems would actually alert us. So while that's good for the patient, because patients still do die from sepsis on a pretty regular basis, it's also a great workflow improvement for nurses because we spend a tremendous amount of effort and time when a patient goes into crisis. Typically, that's when you pull members of the team into one patient's room. You may have a code situation, you may have an emergent situation that requires the nurses to be pulled away from their other patients and all end up in one patient's room for maybe an hour. So if we could prevent that, it actually helps to distribute that work in a much safer, better way across all of the patients and all of the nurses.
Interesting. Nurses are just like the rest of us, and I imagine you are already organizing your grocery delivery on the phone. Nurses might be paying the babysitter via their banking app. They're monitoring deliveries, turning down the heat on their phones, for example. Lots of ways that they're already integrating AI into their own personal lives outside of the hospitals. So I imagine they already trust technology in quite a lot of ways. I'd love you to say a little bit more about that. And is there a specific concern that you've heard from nurses that where they feel wary of artificial intelligence?
Yeah, and again, this is a really great question. So because this continues to evolve and it's somewhat new, we have a little bit of a concern about how much do we trust AI and how much do we trust ourselves, our education, our intuition. And if you think about this from a scope and standards and licensure perspective, nurses do have questions very similar to physicians. What if AI tells you to do something, but your human eyes and ears tell you to do something else, and you do what you believe instead of what the AI said? Are you liable for not doing what AI tells you you should do? Or to the contrary, the other situation. We don't have those things figured out yet, so there's still a lot of work that's gonna have to be done around the ethics of this. We also have to really educate nurses. How is AI built? What does the algorithm look like? What are the challenges? What are the biases? Because we have to educate them how to be comfortable enough to trust it and to use it so that it can really do what we think it will do.
Related question, running out of time, but what do you think about this ethical question? Should AI be allowed to make decisions about life or death?
You know, for me at this point, I think we're first going to have to build a long run rate of trust to see some good positive patient outcomes and some indicators that suggest that that's something that we are comfortable with. I think there's probably going to be a little while before patients are comfortable with that. That's really going to be the bigger litmus test.
Biggest challenge you would like the folks in the room here who have something to do with healthcare to come talk to you for what nurses might be looking at? You mentioned sepsis. Anything else?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities to really learn more about how nurses or nurse brain can actually help you grow and scale the AI that you're working on and the products that you're developing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bonnie Clipper, for joining us here at the AI Global Summit. Thank you
pleasure.
for joining us.